This video we're going to cover how to call a C++ slot from QML. The premise being we're going to make a class, and then when we click this button we're going to call a slot from that class. Let's take a look. Alright, first things first, right click, we're going to add a new file here. There we go. C++, we want this to be a class. Let's call this test. We're going to make this a QObject. And once the IDE adds, there we go. Now we're going to do a few things right off the bat here. So first thing we're going to do, include qdebug. And as we go through this section, I'm going to unapologetically do the C++ because it's just assumed if you're watching this, you know C++. So first thing we're going to do is a normal function. We're going to say int, and let's call this number. And let's do a public slot. If you know C++ with Qt core, you know what a slot is and that we can actually use Qt to connect signals and slots together. So we're going to say void bark. Let's go ahead and implement these. Not a super complex program by any means. All right, so we're just going to return an int. And let's go ahead and actually do a qinfo. And we can just take this, copy, and we're just going to paste right in here. And bark would be like if you were a dog, you'd say bark, bark, bark. I don't know. I could have said meow, but yeah, I figured we show dogs some love. We're always talking about cats, so bark, bark, bark. Let's go ahead and give this a good build. Make sure we don't have any build errors. We shouldn't because this is super, super simple. Now we're going to take this class and integrate it so that we can call it directly out of our QML file. Now our QML is very, very simple. We have a column with a label and a button, and in the button we're calling the onClicked, and this is where we're going to integrate. And just in case you're wondering, let's run this, and this is what it looks like. When I click this, we're going to call that back in C++. Jump into our main. There are a few things we need to do right off the bat. Imports. We need to go ahead and include the qml context and include our class. So let's go down under the engine because the engine's got to exist for this. And we're going to actually, and I'm going to say add to the root context. And this takes a little bit of explaining. So I'm going to say engine dot root context. Now notice there's root objects and it's a queue list and root context. What's the difference between these two? Well, remember from our QML conversation, there can be only one root object. So realistically, that list should have one object in it, and it should be this window. Now Qt does in the background add some things, but for our purposes, that window is the only thing we care about. That's the objects. Root context, on the other hand, are the properties and objects available to the list of root objects. And I'm probably saying that very badly. There's a lot more that happens here, but we want to add something to the root context. So we're going to make this available to everything, you guessed it, at the root. And we're going to set a context property. Notice it's not an object. We're setting a property. And this takes a string and a pointer to a QObject. So I'm going to call this testing. And now we need a pointer. So what we're going to do is say test, test. We're going to make an instance of our class. And we're going to give it a reference to satisfy that pointer. Boom. So basically we're saying create an instance of our class and then take that instance and shove it into the context property. Wow, that's actually pretty cool. So let's go ahead and test this. Notice how it's called testing instead of test. You could name this anything you want. Fuzzy bunny slippers, pink kitty, whatever you want. But I'm just calling it testing. Let's jump into our QML. And I always like to give it a good build just to make sure I didn't goof something up. We got a good build here. So let's go in here. And first things first, we're going to try and call a slot. So let's call that. We're going to say test, and before we even finish typing, IntelliSense is already popping up and seeing our backend class. Testing dot. Notice how there's bark, but there's no number. We look at our class here, number. It sees bark because it's a public slot, but it does not see number. From there, you can pretty much figure out that QML likes working with slots because under the hood, it's doing a lot of connecting of signals and slots in the background. Save and run. And if I bring up the app output, I go ahead and clear it. And we can go bark, bark, bark. So as soon as I click it, it works as expected. Now, let's go ahead and try and call our normal function. And we're going to say, cannot call a non-slot must be a property. Now notice how I'm saying it must be a property, not so much that it must be a slot. We're going to cover properties in another video, but I'm just going to demonstrate if we try to call a normal function, bad things are going to happen. So I'm going to say var num equal testing dot, and IntelliSense is not seeing it, but I'm going to call it anyways. Number. Let's go ahead and print that number. And let's see what happens here. Now, this is the confusing bit, and I'm going to slow down. I'm going to build. We get a good build. See? Compile actually built the executable. So let's go ahead and flip over to app output, and let's run this. Bark, bark, and then, uh-oh, type error, property. Notice how it's calling property, number of object, and then it has the actual pointer is not a function. And this is where people get really confused and really upset because they go, it is a function. I'm literally looking right at the function. But it's saying from QML, it is not a function. All right, what's happening in the background here is we've taken an instance of test, thrown it into the root context, which means it's available to everything. And I'm going to put it's here. And I'm going to say test class it's here, meaning it's right here at the root context and it's available to everything going down through scope. The problem is it's only going to take, you guessed it, the slots, because in the background it's connecting all the signals and slots together. So when you see something like something is not a function, immediately go back, check the spelling, and then check to make sure it's actually a slot. There is a way to connect normal functions, and we're going to cover that in another video, but I want you to be aware of that right off the bat. If you start seeing is not a function, that's typically what's going on.